Ladies and gentlemen, I welcome you to a discussion between Sir Karl Popper and Sir John Eccles. Sir Karl and Sir John are close friends on a personal and philosophical level. I hope and suppose that just this cooperation between a philosophic and scientific approach of problems will make this discussion an intellectual event of the first order. Sir Karl, one of the dangerous pitfalls in this kind of philosophical debates is the general misunderstanding between the expectations of the public, who is looking after philosophers as old, wise men, wiser in any case than other men, and the theoretical talks of philosophers, who often deny they are wiser, but still have enormous pretensions. What's your opinion about yourself as a philosopher and other philosophers in relation to the expectations of the public?
I do think that we all have our philosophies, and most of our philosophies are not very much worth. That is to say, I do think certainly of myself not as wise, but as the very opposite of wise. And I think that the main task of philosophy is to examine critically the various philosophies which various people hold uncritically.
And what's your opinion about philosophers, Sir John?
Well, I suppose I should start off also at the beginning like Sir Karl. I, at the age of 17 or 18 as a medical student, suddenly came up against the problem, what am I? What is the meaning of my existence as I experience it? And I proceeded to read quite a lot about what the philosophers had said and the psychologists, and was profoundly dissatisfied with it. So I decided that they didn't know enough about the brain, and the brain was the essence of all my consciousness and everything that I knew myself to be, my memories and imaginings and so on. So what did I do? I decided that I would learn something myself about it, and I became a neuroscientist and went to Sherrington at Oxford and worked with him, and spent, I thought, in a few years I could know enough about the brain and how it worked, and then I could come back and attack the philosophers on their own grounds, and the psychologists also. And my life has been a matter of progressive postponement of that, because I got so intensely interested and involved in how the brain works. But I have come back to it, and in the last year or so I have had some of my lectures produced as a book, which has come into, that's why I'm here, I suppose, because I did write a book on philosophy. It's personalist philosophy, and it gives you my thoughts now.
Sir Karl, can you explain in a nutshell the meaning of your famous falsifiability criterion in relation with your critical philosophy?
Yes. When I was about 19, so 2 years older than Sir John Eccles, when he had a similar experience, I was struck by the tremendous difference between the attitude of physicists towards physics and the attitude of some psychologists towards psychology. What interested me so much was the following. Einstein, who at that time became very famous because he had predicted a certain effect in eclipses. He had predicted that if you observe the sun during an eclipse, then the stars near the sun become visible, that one knew, and these visible stars would appear to be further removed from each other than they would be at other occasions. Now, Einstein became very famous at this time, and what struck me was that he repeatedly said he made certain predictions and then repeatedly said, if this prediction should turn out wrongly, then my theory is false. Now, try to think of something similar about Freud, who also at that time became very famous. Try to think what possibly could a man do what couldn't be explained by psychoanalysis. Whether he jumps into a sea, into a lake, or whether he throws a child into the lake and jumps after it and takes with life danger the child out. There could be no conceivable action of a person which could not be explained in psychoanalytic terms. But there can be very many things which cannot be explained in Newtonian terms or in Einsteinian terms. If this glass, which contains incidentally apple juice, if this glass would begin to hop just along, and we investigate it and find there's nothing unusual with this glass, then we would have to give up many physical theories, especially Newtonian mechanics, and with it even Einsteinian theory. Einsteinian theory can explain a lot, but this hopping of the glass, it could not explain. As opposed to this, let us say our chairman would begin to hop, then this could be very easily explained in psychoanalytic terms. Here you see the difference between two ways of things which both called themselves science. And I said that what is characteristic of genuine science is that it can be refuted by experience. That is to say that something like this is conceivable, which would refute it. While a science is not genuine, if whatever happens, it is always right. If a so-called science is such that it can explain anything you want, then I said it was a pseudoscience.
Well, but can you demonstrate, Sir Karl, what's the superiority of your falsifiability criterion in relation to the verifiability criterion or principle of the logical positivist of the Vienna Circle?
Yes. It so happens that all this happens in the year 1900. About 1919. I'm wrong. I was not 19 but 17 like you.
Yes.
It happened in the year 1919, and several years later in Vienna, I'm born in Vienna and grew up in Vienna. Several years later in Vienna, there developed a circle of very interesting people. The circle was usually called the Vienna Circle. And this circle, under the influence of a philosopher who since has become very famous, namely Ludwig Wittgenstein, under the influence of this philosopher, this circle did engage itself in a similar problem as I did, but a different problem. There was a certain similarity and a certain difference. Let us start with the difference. The difference was that the circle looked for a criterion of sense. Now, the Vienna Circle said language falls into two parts. One part is nonsense. To this part belongs bibabo, or why. That is nonsense. It's language, but nonsense. And to this part belongs the whole of philosophy. So they said, only science was sense. only science, as opposed to philosophy, was real sense. And the criterion of science was verifiability. That is to say, we could establish the certainty of the scientific proposition. If you can prove something, then it's science, and certain, and you can put it in your pocket. Now you possess something. You possess certainty, and this certainty is sense and science at the same time. So here was one difference. And I didn't say that all philosophy was nonsense, but I said that philosophy was partly non-scientific insofar as it could not be refuted. That part of philosophy which was irrefutable certainly was not scientific. For that reason it wasn't necessarily bad. There can be excellent philosophy which is not refutable. Refutability is not a criterion of sense. So I wasn't against all philosophy, and I wasn't a philosopher of sense and nonsense. The Vienna Circle made the distinction between sense and nonsense. And it so happens, and here is the similarity, it so happens that it said the criterion of sense is also the criterion of scientific character. And both is verifiability. While I said the criterion of scientific character, which is not necessarily the criterion of sense at all, is falsifiability.
Sir John, your encounter with Sir Karl, I believe in New Zealand, has been of a great, perhaps decisive influence on your scientific method and your philosophy of science. Would you explain how your scientific method was before and after your meeting with Sir Karl?
Yes, well, this is a very nice thing to remember on an occasion like this. I had grown up, as I mentioned, in Oxford with Sherrington, and had accepted the ordinary philosophy of science there, namely that you do experiments, you do enough, you publish the results, you go on and do some more, and you have a good mainstream of investigation, and that as a good scientist, you should not be wrong. So I had gone on as a young man fighting for a view of transmission between a nerve fiber and a nerve cell at the synapse or at the nerve muscle junction, believing with others that this was electrical, essentially. The impulse runs down the fibers of the nerve, jumps across with electrical action to the across the gap, and so goes on. Now, I won't go into all this detail, but Dale and Levy, for example, had put up for simpler and slower things the idea that it was a chemical action, that the impulse went down, there was a secretion of acetylcholine, a special chemical substance, which moved across the gap, acted across the gap, and started the electricity off on the other side. I accepted this chemical thing for slower actions, but not for something as fast as when a nerve impulse runs down and a muscle fiber contracts. It takes only 0.005 of a second to get across the gap. I thought that it couldn't be done with the finesse and speed in biochemistry. Well, I've developed these views with many other people, and I think there was about half the scientific opinion for this electrical and half for the chemical. And we admitted the chemical thing, and Dale and Levy got the Nobel Prize in '36 for it, and I still fought against it. I had still believed that it was electrical, but I was getting more and more concerned that I may have made a terrible error, and that I was, as a scientist, this of course you suffer for very much, that you have, as it were, gone wrong and been almost, you might say, a failure in science. Then I met Sir Karl. He came down to Dunedin. He was in Christchurch. And he came down and gave a course of lectures about falsifiability. And he inspired me enormously, because then I realized that the essential thing in science is well, there are two essential things in science. One is to have imagination, to dare, to adventure, to go with ideas beyond what you know, and then to test those ideas in the most rigorous way. You put up your brainchild and you try to shoot it down. And in that way, you advance fantastically in science. He inspired me with this. So I immediately converted my rather vaguely formulated electrical theory into and published it in a quite precise manner and developed another electrical theory for inhibition, and that was published and so on. And there it was now. There was something to refute. And I myself refuted it some years later. In 1951, these clear expressions of what would happen on an electrical story were shot down by our own observations in one night in Dunedin.
I may perhaps interrupt and say that about in 1951 I met in Oxford a very well-known scientist, and I said to him that I was a friend of Eccles, and he said, Eccles, a very good man, but you know the man must be a bit crazy. He refutes his own theories.
Well, that is right. Well, you know, it's not so bad.